"Turn away the vagrant with the dog leash," Lieutenant Logan Prescott said, not looking up from his tablet, and the gate guard's hand went to the radio clipped at his shoulder before he'd even glanced at the man standing on the shoulder of the access road. The man did not move. He stood with a canvas coat gone thin at the cuffs and a leash clasp in his coat pocket, engraved with the initials of a soldier. No one at Fort Carrington Kennel Command had spoken his name to him, and no one there could yet explain how he'd come to own it, or why he'd been parking his truck across from this gate every Wednesday morning for 7 months without once asking to be let in. In under 6 minutes, an animal that had refused the hands of a decorated Navy-adjacent K-9 liaison officer, 2 behavioral consultants flown in from Lackland, and a rotating cast of kennel staff for 7 straight months would cross a concrete run, press its head into that same man's chest, and go still for the first time since its handler died. Nobody at the gate that morning could have told you how. Nobody inside the fence line believed it was coming. If you've ever been counted out before anyone bothered to ask what you knew, type steady in the comments. The guard lowered the radio a half-inch, uncertain, because something in the old man's stillness didn't match the word vagrant, not the way Prescott had used it, tossed off between 2 taps of his knuckle against the corner of his tablet screen, a habit he did before every verdict, the way another man might clear his throat. The old man's name was Odell Sowell, 76 years old, and he had driven 11 miles from a farm outside Millbrook Hollow before sunrise, the way he had every Wednesday since April, in a truck with a bench seat that still smelled faintly of feed dust and diesel. He carried nothing with him but a thermos, a folded cap gone the color of weathered fence board, and the clasp, which he touched twice through the coat pocket, the way another man might touch a coin for luck, though luck was not the word for what it was. Inside the fence, in a kennel run built for animals worth more in training hours than most of the trucks in the lot, a Belgian Malinois named Cedar lay against the concrete with his ribs showing under a coat that had once been kept glossy by a dead man's hands, and he had not eaten a full ration in 9 days, and he had stopped, 3 weeks ago, even lifting his head when the gate latch clicked. Prescott did not know yet that the old man standing at his gate had trained the soldier Cedar was still waiting for. He knew only that a stooped stranger in a farm coat had been photographed by the perimeter camera 9 Wednesdays running, parked at the same angle, engine off, doing nothing anyone could file a report about, and that today, for reasons Prescott would spend the rest of the week trying and failing to explain to his own satisfaction, the man had gotten out of the truck and started walking toward the gate instead of waiting beside it. The guard's radio crackled. Somewhere behind the kennel block, a dog that had not made a sound in 6 days lifted his head off the concrete, ears swiveling toward a sound too faint for any human at the gate to have heard at all. Odell Sowell stopped 10 feet from the guard shack, hands loose at his sides, and waited to be told no, the way he had waited 7 months for something he had not yet let himself name out loud. Every Wednesday since the 2nd week of April, Odell Sowell parked his truck on the gravel turnout across from the Fort Carrington access road, cut the engine, and did not go in. He came at the same hour each time, a few minutes shy of 8, so the light came in low and yellow across the razor wire and made the whole compound look, for a stretch of maybe 10 minutes, almost gentle. He wore the same coat every week, canvas gone the color of a field after first frost, thinned at the elbows and the cuffs, where 50 years of reaching into truck beds and gate latches had worn the fabric down to something closer to paper than cloth. Underneath it, a flannel shirt washed so many times the plaid had faded to a memory of itself, soft as a bandage against his skin. His left hand carried a tremor that had lived in him since his early 60s, a fine, persistent shiver that showed up worst in cold weather, or when he'd been gripping something too long, a souvenir of nerve damage from hauling feed sacks 2 at a time for longer than any doctor thought reasonable. It did not embarrass him. He had stopped noticing it the way a man stops noticing his own heartbeat, except for the one thing that always startled him a little, every single time it happened, the moment his fingers closed around a leash clasp or the leather loop of a dog collar, the tremor stopped, flat and complete, as if his hand understood something his mind had quit trying to explain. In the right pocket of the barn coat, worn soft on the inside from the particular oil of a man's hand, returning to it again and again, he carried a leash clasp of cracked leather, brass gone dull, with two initials pressed into the surface, WM. He had carried it every day for 7 months. Before that, he had kept it in a cigar box on a shelf in his barn for the better part of 5 decades, next to a photograph of his wife holding a jar of green beans up to the light like she was toasting the camera with it. He did not go in. That was the thing that would have puzzled anyone watching closely enough to notice the pattern, if anyone at the base had been watching closely at all before Wednesday 9. A man who drives 11 miles before dawn, week after week, to sit outside a gate he never tries to open, is either a man with nowhere else he'd rather be, or a man keeping a kind of vigil he has not decided how to end. Odell hummed while he waited, low, almost under the range of hearing, more breath than melody, a hymn his wife Ida used to hum every September while she stood over the stove with jars lined up on a towel, steam fogging the kitchen window, the whole house smelling of vinegar and dill and boiling water. Ida Sowell had been dead 6 years now, her heart giving out on a Tuesday in October, the way some machines simply stop rather than break, and Odell had gone on humming her canning hymn anyway, at the workbench, in the truck, standing in gravel lots outside gates that were not his to walk through, because some rituals are not about the person left behind remembering correctly. They are about keeping a shape in the air that a life used to fill. He had been a handler once himself, though nothing about him advertised it now. No cap with a unit patch, no bumper sticker, no ring worn thin with pride. 4 years, 1967 to 1971, training sentry dogs and scout dogs for other men to lead into places Odell himself only ever heard about secondhand, back at the kennels, matching green boys to green dogs, and trying, in his quiet, unglamorous way, to get as many of both home again as the war would allow. He did not talk about it. He had built a life instead, a farm, a marriage of 50 years, a silence about his own record so complete that even the men at the feed store who'd known him 30 years thought of him only as the fellow with the good dog sense and the bad left hand. What he had not told a single soul at Fort Carrington, in 9 Wednesdays of sitting outside their fence, was that 7 months ago, a young corporal named Whitney Mosier had died of a heart condition nobody caught in time, and that Odell had been the man, decades before, who trained him. The dog Mosier left behind would not eat. Odell knew this the way he knew weather was coming before the radio said so, not from any report, but from the particular quality of quiet that hung over a place when something in it was starving itself out of grief. He had not gone in because he did not know yet if anyone inside that fence would believe an old farmer who arrived with nothing but a cracked leash clasp and a hymn nobody there had ever heard. He touched the clasp through his coat pocket, the way he did every Wednesday at this hour, and watched the sun climb another degree over the wire, and waited. Lieutenant Logan Prescott had not lost a single dog on his watch in 3 years, and he intended for that streak to survive Cedar. He was 29 years old, built like a man who ran distance for pleasure rather than obligation, and he carried a tablet loaded with more data on that one Malinois than most veterinary hospitals kept on an entire kennel. Cortisol assays drawn twice weekly, sleep cycle overlays, a heart rate variability chart stretching back 7 months in a jagged red line that told, better than any report, the story of an animal coming apart in slow motion. He had a master's degree in animal cognition from a program that had accepted 11 applicants that year, and he had written his thesis on stress response patterning in working dogs separated from long-term handlers, which made Cedar, on paper, exactly the kind of case he should have been able to solve. That Tuesday morning he tried anyway, the way he tried every morning, because trying was not performance for Prescott. It was who he was when no one important was watching. He knelt at the edge of Cedar's run with a scent article in a gloved hand, a training toy that had belonged to Corporal Whitney Mosier, worn nearly bald from years of tug and reward, and he moved with the unhurried patience of a man who genuinely believed, cell by cell, that this dog could be reached if he only found the right sequence. He kept his shoulders low. He did not make eye contact directly, the textbook approach, the one that worked on 80% of trauma cases in his own published data. He set the toy down 18 inches from Cedar's nose and waited, counting his own breaths, the way he'd once counted a wounded teammate's breaths in a different life before the Navy sent him toward dogs instead of men. Cedar did not lift his head. His ribs rose and fell, shallow, and one ear rotated a slow quarter turn toward the sound of Prescott's voice, then stopped, as if even that motion cost more than it was worth. "Come on," Prescott said, so quiet it was almost only for himself. "Come on, buddy. I know you're in there." 9 days without a full ration. 3 weeks since he'd lifted his head for a latch click. Prescott logged it all, tapped the corner of his tablet twice, and delivered, to no one but the empty run, the verdict he'd been circling for a month and dreading having to write down: temperament fault, non-reversible, incompatible with continued service. He was standing at the fence line 20 minutes later, tablet under one arm, when Corporal Sloan Colvin came around the kennel block at a jog and told him there was a man at the gate again, and this time he'd walked up instead of waiting in his truck. Prescott found Odell Sowell standing just inside the visitor lot, coat thin at the elbows, cap in one hand, looking at the kennel block the way a man looks at a house he used to live in. "Sir, you can't be on this property," Prescott said, and it came out clipped, tired in a way that had nothing to do with Odell, and everything to do with a dog who wouldn't eat. "This is a working military kennel. It's not open to the public, and it's definitely not a spot to park and watch for." He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, though the staff gathering near the fence line, drawn by the sight of a stranger where no stranger belonged, could fill in the rest well enough. "I'd be obliged for a few minutes," Odell said. 3 sentences was near his limit for a stranger, and he'd already used one. "I don't doubt you mean well," Prescott said, not unkindly, though his patience had a floor, and he'd reached it somewhere around dog number 4 that week. He turned toward the guard who'd trailed him from the gate. "Turn away the vagrant with the dog leash. He's not on any visitor list. He's not cleared for this kennel, and frankly, sir," this last aimed at Odell directly, gentler than the words deserved, "you don't strike me as someone with the credentials this situation calls for." The guard took Odell's elbow, light, apologetic. Sloan stood at the edge of the gathered staff and said nothing, but she watched Odell's face the whole way to the gate, and what she saw there was not embarrassment. It was patience, the specific kind that comes from a man who has been told no before and has learned that no is rarely the end of the story, only a comma in it. Sloan Colvin waited until the lot lights kicked off automatically at 9, and the kennel block settled into the particular hush of a place built for daytime, now empty of daytime purpose. She was 24, 3 years into a job she'd wanted since she was 11 years old, watching a demonstration team at a county fair, and she had spent 7 months watching Cedar fail to respond to every credentialed hand the Army could produce, and something about that failure had started to sit wrong in her, the way a held note sits wrong when it never resolves. She found Odell's truck exactly where it always was, engine off, and she did not call out to him. She simply unlatched the service gate near the kennel's rear fence line, stepped back, and said, "You've got 20 minutes before the next patrol swings this way." "I didn't see anybody." Odell nodded once, the kind of nod that carries a debt in it, and walked to the fence. He did not speak to Cedar. He did not crouch or coax or offer the low, crooning voice Prescott used, the one built from 3 years of published technique. He stood at the fence with his hands in his coat pocket, one of them closed loosely around the clasp, and he watched. Cedar lay against the far wall of the run, in the same position Sloan had seen him hold for most of the last 3 weeks, head resting on the concrete at an angle that let one ear stay lifted, always, toward the gate. His breathing came shallow and quick, 40, maybe 45 breaths a minute by Odell's count, a rhythm that had nothing to do with heat or exertion and everything to do with a body that had forgotten how to rest. "He's not sleeping," Odell said, after a long while, mostly to himself, though Sloan had drifted close enough to hear. "That head's down, but that ear's up. Man that's grieving does that too. Lays down because the body gives out, keeps one part of himself listening because some part of him hasn't quit hoping yet. Sloan frowned at the run. The reports call it hypervigilance. Prescott's got 3 separate scales measuring it. Scales don't ask what he's vigilant for, Odell said. He watched another few minutes in silence. Cedar's tail, thin from muscle loss, twitched once when a truck passed on the road beyond the fence, then stilled. His breathing catches on the exhale, Odell said. Listen to it. Not the in-breath, the out. That's not fear breathing. Fear breathing catches coming in, like the body's bracing to take a hit. His catches going out, like he's holding on to something and can't quite let it go, each time. He was quiet a moment, watching the slow rise and fall. That's not a dog protecting himself. That's a dog trying not to lose the last thing he's got left of somebody. Sloan said nothing for a long moment, because she had read Prescott's charts 100 times, and none of them had a box for that. The tablet doesn't measure that, she said finally. Tablets measure what's there, Odell said. Can't measure what's gone. He stayed another quarter hour, saying almost nothing more, only once observing that Cedar's ears tracked toward the low hum of the kennel's ventilation fan and away from human footsteps, which told him the dog had learned, somewhere in 7 months of disappointment, that footsteps meant another stranger, and the fan meant nothing was about to change. When the 20 minutes ran out, Odell touched 2 fingers to his cap in Sloan's direction and walked back to his truck without asking for anything more than what he'd been given. Sloan latched the gate behind him and stood a long while at the fence herself, watching Cedar's ear lift, again, toward the sound of an engine starting far off in the lot and staying lifted long after the truck had pulled away. The next morning, before the shift change, Sloan found Prescott in the kennel office and told him, without quite meeting his eyes, that she thought the old man from the gate ought to be let inside the run, just once, under her authority if his own wasn't given. Prescott's first instinct, 3 years of training and a career built on rigor, telling him no, softened only because Cedar had gone another full day without eating, and because some small, unscientific part of him had started to run out of other ideas worth trying. He agreed on one condition: he would be present. He was not willing to be wrong about this in private. Odell Sowell walked into the kennel block a little after 4 that afternoon, coat still thin at the cuffs, cap in his hand, and when Sloan opened the gate to Cedar's run, he did not hesitate at the threshold, the way most visitors did, checking the concrete, checking the dog's posture, checking for permission written somewhere in the air. He walked in like a man returning to a familiar room and lowered himself, slow, joints audibly protesting, until he was sitting cross-legged on the cold concrete floor, 6 feet from where Cedar lay. Prescott stood at the gate with his tablet lowered at his side for the first time in 7 months, watching. Odell reached into his coat pocket and drew out the cracked leather clasp, brass dulled with age, 2 initials pressed into the leather, WM. He held it loosely in his open palm, not offering it, not reaching toward the dog, simply holding it where the air could carry whatever it still carried. Cedar's head lifted off the concrete for the first time in 3 weeks. Odell began to hum, low, barely more than breath moving through his chest, the same hymn Ida used to hum over jars of green beans on a September stove, a melody that had nothing to do with any soldier or any dog, and everything to do with the particular cadence of a life spent keeping faith with what was gone. It was not a hymn Cedar could have known. But somewhere in Whitney Mosier's training log, in a margin note none of the official behavioral files had thought worth transcribing, a young corporal had once written down that his dog settled fastest to a low, wordless hum, a habit Mosier picked up, without ever knowing its source, from the old trainer who'd paired them together years before Prescott had ever heard the name Cedar. Cedar rose. His legs, thinned from 9 days of refused rations, trembled with the effort, and he crossed the 6 feet of concrete slower than any dog his training file described, ears flattening not in fear, but in something closer to surrender, and he did not stop at Odell's hand. He pressed his head, full weight, into the old man's chest and went still. Not the stillness of exhaustion, not the collapse Prescott had charted a dozen times as the body simply giving out. This was a different stillness, the kind that comes when a held breath finally releases, when a body that has spent 7 months listening for one particular set of footsteps finally stops straining toward the gate and lets itself rest against the nearest thing that smells, faintly, impossibly, of the right kind of care. Odell's left hand, tremor and all, came up slow and closed around the back of Cedar's collar, and the shiver in his fingers stopped, flat and complete, the way it always did. "There now," Odell said, so quiet it barely reached the fence. "There now, I know." Prescott stood at the gate with his tablet arm hanging slack, 7 months of cortisol charts and sleep cycle overlays and published methodology suddenly weightless in his hands, watching an animal his entire discipline could not reach go silent in the arms of a stranger in a barn coat, and for a long moment he did not trust himself to say anything at all. "He's not unfit," Odell said, so low that only Sloan, crouched near the gate, caught the whole of it. "He's waiting for the only kind of hand that ever came back for him." Prescott found his voice before Sloan found hers, though it came out smaller than he meant it to. "That's not in any protocol I've ever read." "Wasn't meant to be in a protocol," Odell said, not unkindly. "Was meant to be in him." Prescott stood at the gate a long while after Cedar had settled fully into sleep against Odell's crossed legs, tablet still hanging useless at his side, and when he finally spoke again, it was not to argue. "There's something you need to know," he said, "and I wish to God I had more than 3 days to tell you gently." He explained it the way a man explains a diagnosis he didn't write, but now has to deliver. Flat, careful, watching Odell's face for the moment it landed. Cedar's transfer order had been signed 6 weeks earlier, the paperwork moving through channels so routine that no one along the chain had thought to flag it for a second look. Thursday morning, 0900, a truck from a private contractor kennel would arrive at the gate to take Cedar off the base permanently, out of the military system and into a program that did not preserve service records the way the Army did, a program that would file him under a new designation with no mention of Corporal Whitney Mosier at all. "The file calls it a permanent temperament fault," Prescott said. "Not grief. There's no box for grief. There's a box for behavioral instability, incompatible with continued service, and once that box gets checked and the transfer clears, there's no path back. Not through me. Not through anybody on this base." Sloan had gone very still near the gate, one hand pressed flat against the chain link. "Who wrote the box?" Odell asked. His hand was still resting on Cedar's collar, and the tremor had not returned. Prescott hesitated, the way a man hesitates before naming his own employer's failure out loud. "There's a cost review policy that came down 8 years ago, before I ever got here. Civilian side. A program administrator named Corey Carrington wrote the fast-track criteria. Any working dog that fails to reintegrate with a new handler within 6 months gets classified unfit and routed to civilian transfer instead of extended rehabilitation. It saves the kennel budget a substantial sum every year. It's not personal, it's just policy, working exactly the way it was designed to work." He looked, for the first time, genuinely uncertain of his own ground. Cedar's case went through that pipeline like any other. Nobody flagged it as different, because on paper, it isn't. "Except it is," Sloan said. "Except it is," Prescott agreed, quieter than before. "And I can't override a signed transfer order. I don't have that authority. There's exactly one person on this base's advisory roster who can halt it, and he's not on this base." He checked the clock above the kennel office door. "Colonel Radcliffe. He's 3 states away, and he boards a flight in 9 minutes." The clock above the office door read 3:41. Prescott's own hands, steady through 7 months of failed interventions, were not steady now. 9 minutes, Sloan repeated, already moving toward the office phone, already dialing a number she'd saved in her contacts for a man she'd met exactly twice. Odell did not move from the concrete floor. Cedar's breathing had slowed to something almost peaceful against his chest, 12 breaths a minute where there had been 45 an hour before, and the old man kept his hand where it was, tremor stilled, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing left in his 3 sentences to spend on a phone call he had no authority to make. Prescott stood over his own tablet like it had betrayed him, which, in its way, it had. He'd pulled up his master's thesis on the drive back from the parking lot, some instinct telling him to check his own data before he trusted anyone else's verdict, and what he found waiting there stopped him cold in the kennel office doorway. Buried in his own appendix, in charts he had generated 3 years earlier, studying stress biomarkers in dogs, separated from long-term handlers, sat a cluster of readings he had labeled, at the time, as an unresolved outlier, elevated cortisol paired with depressed heart rate variability, a pattern that matched almost point for point the bereavement studies he'd cited from human psychology literature, studies on grief physiology in widowers and widows in the first year of loss. He had written, in his own hand, 3 years ago, that the pattern deserved further study. He had never studied it further. His own instrument had never been built to flag the word grief. It only knew how to flag fault. "He's right," Prescott said, mostly to himself, tablet trembling faintly in his own 2 hands now. "I proved it myself, and I filed it as a footnote." Sloane had the phone against her ear, the line ringing twice, 3 times, and when Colonel Alton Radcliffe finally picked up, his voice carried the particular strain of a man already walking toward a gate agent with a boarding pass in his hand. "Colonel, this is Corporal Sloane Colvin, Fort Carrington Kennel Command. I'm sorry to call you like this, but we've got a transfer scheduled for Thursday on a dog named Cedar, and I think the file's wrong, and there's a man here." She stopped, uncertain how to say the next part, so it would land in 9 minutes instead of 9 hours. "There's a man here named Odell Sowell." The line went quiet, in a way that had nothing to do with signal. "Say that name again," Radcliffe said, and his voice had changed entirely, some old weight settling into it. "Odell Sowell," Sloane said. "He's sitting on the floor of a kennel run right now with your dog asleep against his chest." Radcliffe did not answer right away. When he did, his voice carried a crack down the middle of one word, and the word was not a rank or a command. It was simply the name again, said the way a man says a debt he thought he'd never have to repay. "Sowell," he said, "I owe that man 48 years, and I never once went back to pay it." He told her, in the compressed, urgent shorthand of a man watching his gate close, that decades ago, as a young lieutenant fresh into a logistics command he barely understood, he had nearly washed a struggling young soldier out of the service entirely. A boy named Whitney Mosier, undisciplined on paper, failing every posting they gave him, one signature away from discharge. It was Odell Sowell, then a quiet, unremarkable kennel trainer nobody thought to consult, who had pulled Radcliffe aside and told him the boy wasn't failing, he was misplaced, and that if they gave him a dog instead of a rifle, he'd become the best handler the unit ever fielded. Radcliffe had signed the transfer on Odell's word alone, and never told a soul where the idea came from. "Whitney Mosier became the finest handler I ever watched work a line," Radcliffe said, "and it's because an old trainer, nobody remembers, vouched for a boy nobody else would. Don't let that truck leave Thursday. I'm getting off this flight." He hung up before the gate agent could stop him. Colonel Alton Radcliffe arrived at Fort Carrington Kennel Command at 0640 Thursday morning, 2 hours and 20 minutes ahead of the scheduled transport, in a rental car still smelling of the airport lot, and he did not go to the administrative office first. He went to the kennel block, where Sloane had already gathered the morning shift, where Prescott stood with a folder of his own thesis pages tucked under one arm, like evidence he meant to submit against himself, and where Odell Sowell sat on an overturned feed bucket outside Cedar's Run, coat still thin at the cuffs, hand resting easy on the dog's collar. Radcliffe crossed the concrete floor at a pace that had nothing hurried in it and everything deliberate, the walk of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his head for longer than he would ever say out loud. He stopped 3 feet from Odell, drew himself up the way men his age had been taught to draw themselves up 60 years before, and came to attention. "Sir," Radcliffe said, and the word cracked clean down its center, the way Sloane had heard it crack on the phone. "It's an honor." The kennel block went silent in a way that had weight to it, the particular silence of a room recalibrating everything it thought it understood about the man on the feed bucket. Radcliffe did not stop there. He reached into his jacket and drew out a single sheet, a photocopy of a service record he'd requested, pulled and faxed to him at 5 a.m. that morning, and he read from it the way a man reads something he has waited decades to say aloud in the right company. Corporal Whitney Mosier, Radcliffe said, enlisted at 19, nearly discharged for cause at 20, on my signature, before a kennel trainer named Odell Sowell told me I had the wrong read on the boy entirely. Reassigned to K9 handling on Sowell's recommendation alone. Went on to serve 11 years as one of the finest working dog handlers this command ever fielded, and died 7 months ago having given that dog. He nodded toward the run, where Cedar had lifted his head to watch. 11 years of a life he might never have had, if an old trainer nobody was watching hadn't said something true when it cost him nothing to stay quiet. Prescott stepped forward, folder still under his arm, and for the first time in 7 months, his knuckle did not tap the corner of any screen before he spoke. "Sir, the transfer order," he said. "I need it torn up today, and I need to rewrite the intake policy so Grief has a box of its own, because it's had one all along in my own data, and I filed it under a word that never fit." "Tear it up," Radcliffe said, not looking away from Odell, "and find Corey Carrington a desk somewhere that isn't within reach of a kennel budget for a good long while. That policy's under review starting this morning." Odell had said nothing through all of it, hand still resting on Cedar's collar. Tremor stilled the way it always went stilled there. When Radcliffe finally turned the full weight of his attention on him, waiting, the whole room waiting with him, Odell offered only what he'd come to say from the start. "Their names should be in that file," he said. "Mosier's, the dog's, not mine. I didn't do anything Thursday morning that anybody here couldn't have learned, if the file had a place to write it down." He looked at Prescott then, and his voice, when it came again, carried none of the correction it might have. "You did good work these 7 months. Your numbers were right. You just didn't have a word for what you were looking at yet. Most men don't. First time Grief walks in, wearing fur, instead of a face they recognize." Prescott's jaw worked once before he answered. "I'd be grateful for anything you'd teach me. About reading him, about what I missed." "Come by some evening," Odell said. "Bring the tablet if you want it. Won't need it, but you're welcome to bring it." Radcliffe signed the order that voided Thursday's transport standing right there on the kennel floor, using the hood of a supply cart as a desk, and when he handed the torn halves of the original transfer paperwork to Sloan to file as void, his hand, veteran of 48 years and a debt he'd finally paid, was not entirely steady either. 6 weeks later, on a Saturday morning gone gold with early October light, a government transport van turned off the county road and idled at the end of Odell Sowell's gravel drive, and Cedar came down the ramp on his own forelegs, coat glossy again, weight back on him, tail moving in a rhythm no chart had ever needed to measure. The corrected program allowed for weekend visits now, a line in a policy Prescott had rewritten himself, in his own hand, in the same binder that used to hold nothing but cortisol assays. Grief-adjacent behavioral decline. Recommend continuity of contact with identified stabilizing figure rather than automatic transfer. He had submitted it under his own name and let it stand as the correction it was. No footnote, no hedge. Odell met the dog at the porch steps, knees complaining the way they always did now, and Cedar came to him without hesitation, the way he had every Saturday for the last month, pressing his head into the old man's chest before doing anything else at all, the way some habits, once restored, simply become the shape a life takes back. In the barn that afternoon, Odell took down the cigar box from its shelf and lifted out the leash clasp, brass gone dull with 50 years of handling, cracked leather softened past cracking any further. He'd had it cleaned and restrung the week before, onto a new collar sized for a working dog who still had years of good service left in him if the army would let him keep giving them near a hand he trusted. He set it now on the shelf itself, at rest, beside a photograph of Ida, holding a jar of green beans up to kitchen light, and he stood there a moment with his hand flat against the wood. He hummed the hymn, low, the way he always did, and through the open barn door, Cedar lay stretched in the yard grass within clear sight of the porch, ears loose, breathing slow and even, the particular stillness of a creature no longer listening for a gate that would never open again, because he had found, instead, a hand that kept coming back. Some debts take 50 years to come due, and they always come due in full. The following Wednesday, Odell's truck came up the Fort Carrington access road, same as always, a few minutes shy of 8, morning light lying low and gold across the wire. Lieutenant Logan Prescott stood at the gate before Odell had even slowed to a stop, and he waved him through without a word, without a glance at any clipboard, the barrier arm lifting clean and easy, the way a door opens for a man who was never really a stranger to the place at all.